Hello, everyone. This is the third in a series of review videos for the final exam. Again, the final exam will consist once more of a series of hypotheticals for which you will need to write ethical analyses. And it is an exercise in the employment of the methods and principles of the text that you've read. So once again, it's not like the first assignment we had for the Joe scenario or the first one we had for the Jane scenario, where you simply give me an ethical analysis based upon your opinion of the matter. It's more of an exercise in the application of principles that you uh, that we found in various authors, Kant, Mill, and then authors now like Thomson, Marquis, Singer, and Arthur. And this is perhaps a different sort of thing, or less obvious sort of thing, what I'm going to be asking you to do, because looking over Kant and Mill, I mean, those are theoretical works of philosophy. That is, they were um, general, wide ranging works meant to provide a foundation for morality and to provide the reader or convince the reader of a certain approach to solving moral questions, general approach, the categorical imperatives, the greatest happiness principle. So it lent itself to that sort of, well, here's something that gives you some principles. Now apply them to this specific hypothetical situation. When we begin to look at things like Thomson and the other readings, these are not primarily theoretical works of philosophy that we then sort of can apply to specific situations. They are essays about specific issues like abortion and charitable giving. So it's not quite as obvious what it would mean. I mean, I'm not going to give you a hypothetical about abortion to to show your knowledge of Thomson. I'm not going to give you a hypothetical about charitable giving necessarily to show your knowledge of Singer. So what does it mean? Well, I think that we can all agree that, especially with not having all read it and thought about it, written about it, I think we can all agree that, especially with Judith Jarvis Thompson's essay, A Defense of Abortion, that the kind of things that she talks about in her approach to the abortion issue is certainly the principles, the reasons that she gives for her analysis are, I think, certainly applicable to a wider range of issues than abortion. And I would just suggest that you take a look at the kind of questions that are brought up by her. Really, three hypothetical scenarios. Obviously, the most famous one being the famous violinist scenario, where you find yourself you've been kidnapped and you wake up and you're hooked up intravenously to a person who needs use of your kidneys, use of your body to live. And the question is, do you have the right to unhook yourself, thereby ending that person's life? The other two I'm thinking of are the Henry Fonda scenario, where Judith Jarvis Thompson imagines that she's got some deathly illness that can only be cured if the famous movie actor Henry Fonda visits her and lays his hand on her fevered brow, as she says, which is hilarious. Um, Especially if you kind of know who Henry Fonda was. Great actor. Let me see if I can. What page is that on? The Henry Fonda thing. Pretty far in. Yeah, page 55 is where we get the Henry Fonda scenario. And the question is, does Judith Jarvis Thompson or any of us, if the only thing that will save our lives is if Henry Fonda visits us and simply puts his hand on our brow, do we have a right to that? And then finally, the last thing I'm thinking of is the scenario involving the two brothers and the box of chocolates, which is that's on page 56. Um, Suppose a boy and his small brother are jointly given a box of chocolates for Christmas, etc. We think about those three scenarios and the way that she deals with them and the kind of principles that she's trying to make clear from those hypotheticals, from those little these little made up little scenarios. They're obviously not, again, restricted to the one issue of abortion. You know, um, for instance, if we go back to the scenario involving the famous violinist, really what she's pointing up there is that, you know, on a first glance, because if you unhook the violinist, they will die. So something worse is happening to you, to them, than what happens to you if you have to lay there with them, let's say for 9 months, and let them use your body so they can live. On a strictly, I guess, utilitarian face of it, utilitarian calculus, you can unhook yourself, but you know, she thinks that that's outrageous. That is, no one can be forced, especially if they're, you know, if they're going to die if they're hooked up. But no one can be forced to lay there with the violinist hooked up to them. And why is that? I mean, if we say that the violinist, as she admits the fetus does, you know, at least for purposes of argument, is a person, then we admit they have the right to life. So really the question is, if in killing them, aren't you violating their right to life? And her answer to that, in a very interesting way, is of course, no, you're not necessarily violating the right to life by killing them. By, if you want to call unhooking them from you killing them, it's because they do have a right to life, and so do we all. But the right to life is not the right not to be killed per se. It's the right not to be killed unjustly. And I can never find that very easily where she actually comes out and says that. That's your job in studying. If you want to find that passage where Thomson actually says that the right to life is not the right not to be killed, it's the right not to be killed unjustly. You find that passage, because that's important. I'm not going to spend 2 minutes doing it now, but you know what I mean. You know, when she says that, it's incredibly important. So that is an example of the kind of principle that clearly is something that is more wide-ranging than the one issue of abortion. The notion that the right to life is not the right not to be killed, but the right not to be killed unjustly. This generality, I think, is even more obvious in the case of the Henry Fonda scenario, because really it's a question about what we have a right to, especially what we have a right to in order to live. If what I need in order to live is for Henry Fonda to come visit me, that does not mean I have a right to. In fact, I think she's pretty explicit in saying that I have no right to a visit from Henry Fonda, even if it is something that I need to live, nor does he, on his side, have any obligation to visit me, right? That he would not be doing me an injustice by refusing refusing to visit me, because I have no right to that. When they say the reflection there on the famous violinist scenario is that I'm not doing the violinist an injustice by unhooking him, because he has no right to the use of my body in the first place. Right? And then the third scenario involving the two boys, the way I remember it, is that there's two different versions of it. One, one in which the two brothers are given the box of chocolates to be shared by grandma, and the older brother just eats them all. The older brother has then done an injustice to his younger brother, because the younger brother has a right to half the chocolates. But if the chocolates have been given to the older brother, and he just selfishly eats them all in front of his younger brother, not sharing, though he didn't do his younger brother any injustice. He didn't violate any right that his younger brother had, because his younger brother in that case didn't have a right to the chocolates. So, this, I think, leads directly to the sort of one of the other big theoretical things hanging around Thomson's essay, which is the distinction between injustice and indecency. Because I think of that in terms of the older brother. If the older brother has been given the chocolates solely to him, and then he eats them all in front of his younger brother, he does not act unjustly to the younger brother, but he does act indecently. He fails to to act decently. If Henry Fonda, let's say he's on the other side of the room as opposed to the other side of the country, let's say in Hollywood, and um, all that you need to live is for him to walk over and put his hand on your brow, but he refuses to take the few steps and do it. Well, since you had no right to him doing it, then it couldn't be called an injustice, but it would certainly perhaps be called indecent. And this obviously complicates, as we saw in class, the whole discussion of abortion, because she certainly leaves open the possibility that some abortions, while they are not unjust, although there are obviously, from the exam I gave you, I do believe that she suggests that there are unjust abortions, and those would be the abortions in which the fetus does have a right to the use of the mother's body, but she never really lays out under what conditions it can be said that the fetus does, just to say that parenthetically. But even so, there are probably abortions that are perfectly just, insofar as one could not say that the fetus had a right to the use of a woman's body to live, but could be called indecent. That is, you know, that is that there's a minimal Samaritanism. I think that's what she calls it. You got to read it. I just have to write the questions. But she talks about Samaritanism at the end, and what she seems to conceive of that is that even though we don't have an obligation to act to make sacrifices for others, that under certain conditions, a minimal amount of Samaritanism, let's say a minimally supererogatory act, and you would know what that means, right, at this point, is perhaps, just kind of like expected, right? Because it would be not to be willing to do something for somebody that would take minimal effort or minimal sacrifice would fall below the level of decency that she thinks that we have to maintain. And of course, then there would be splendid Samaritans who are heroic. So this whole distinction between the unjust and the indecent, or what is morally obligatory or obligatory to do, and what is simply would be decent to do, or even heroic to do, does it kind of muddies the waters in terms of how we're actually supposed to think of abortion. But right. I mean, what she says on page 61, I think, is relevant. So my own view is that even though you ought to let the violinist use your kidneys for the 1 hour he needs, we should not conclude that he has a right to do so. We should say that if you refuse, you are like the boy who owns all the chocolates and will give none away, self-centered and callous, indecent, in fact, but not unjust. So it's a good contrast, a good distinction between the indecent and the unjust. So these kind of general ideas that I've been reviewing, right to life, meaning the right not to be killed unjustly, as opposed to right not to be killed, the distinction between justice and indecency, the whole question of what I have a right to and what others are obliged to do for me is all really very rich in possibilities to be applied to other scenarios other than abortion. And obviously the whole question of rights and right to something is going to be not directly, but is certainly related to what Arthur says about the distinction between negative and positive rights. So there might be something linking Thomson and Arthur in terms of application. So those are the kind of general ideas from Thomson I think that you should be familiar with. Just read through the essay, such a wonderful essay, to refresh yourself on those. The question most likely will not be about abortion. It'll be about applying and working out these different general ideas that she's employing on some other topic, some scenario not having to do with abortion.